These are always fun to make, so I figured I'd make another one. This is the Industrial Iceberg chart. I've already made a handful of these charts on my channel, so I'm not going to bother wasting any time describing how this template works. But there's going to be 7 tiers, and as I stated, it's all going to be about industrial music. About a week ago, I made a video asking what exactly is industrial music. And from my understanding of it, it's a style of music that really encourages experimentation, that it's very fluid, and it doesn't actually have its own set of rules to follow. It doesn't really have a structure either attached with it. And because of that, it seems like you can inadvertently create industrial music and not even be aware of it. If you can manipulate the sound of any instrument, from a synthesizer to even a guitar, that's a form of industrial music. Or you can just use the most unorthodox set of materials out there and it still becomes industrial. Like, it's a very fluid genre, as I stated, and that's what makes it really interesting. And because of that, it's quite difficult to a certain degree to pinpoint exactly what is an industrial artist. They could just be like a form of experimentation, but again, that tag is always like attached with some of these artists. So I do expect, for the most part, people to disagree with me with some of my choices, because again, some of these artists and bands I'm going to be bringing up within this chart, they're not exactly like industrial artists, but that tag always seems to be attached with them, with the ways they experiment. With all of that out of the way, let's start this iceberg chart, and we start off at tier number 1, which I called accessible industrial. Let me start off by saying that when I say accessible industrial, I don't mean this in an insulting way, that it's easy to make, it's cheap, that it's not good, it's a dime a dozen, because I feel like the internet has turned that word, that it's now an insult. I feel like if you can make industrial music accessible to a wider audience, you have as just much musical integrity and creativity as any other of the obscure and esoteric kinds of industrial acts. Because again, industrial doesn't have like a rule book to follow, and if you can mold it in a way that can appeal to a wider audience, that takes as much talent as anything else. Obviously, I'm just going to get the big names out of the way that you probably are already guessing are going to be on top. That if you search up the word industrial music, these are what comes up. So obviously, 9 Inch Nails, which I know Trent Reznor has always said he never thought it was an industrial band, but it doesn't change the fact that, again, the term industrial rock or alternative rock industrial is always attached with 9 Inch Nails. Then there's Skinny Puppy, the band that heavily influenced Trent when starting 9 Inch Nails, along with Ministry. I would also include Rammstein, Marilyn Manson, and Rob Zombie. And while all of these bands and artists are more labeled as like alternative rock and alternative metal, they have subtle usages of industrial music with how they kind of manipulate the electronics and keyboards within some of their albums. That, again, that term industrial has been attached with these artists. Then there's KMFDM, which is, I believe, a German like industrial rock metal outfit, that all their albums from the 90s, I would say it's kind of like you take the approach of Ministry, but you just make the production value more beefed up. That almost sounds like a stadium rock version of Ministry. That I would say this is a great gateway band if you want to get into what the styles of industrial rock and industrial metal can give to the listener. And finally, to close out this tier, will be Swans with their debut full-length album, Filth. Now, Swans has experimented a lot throughout their careers. It's really mesmerizing, all the different styles of music that they played around with. But Filth is an approach of like noise rock and punk music, but with all the reverbs and noises and kind of like, again, manipulations they do within post-production, the idea of it being industrial inadvertently, how they created it with their experimentation, kind of fits with this particular album. So I would say they're kind of like the oddball when it comes to accessible industrial music. Moving on down this chart, we reach tier number 2, which I call club industrial. So this tier consists of all industrial projects that play around with EBM. which is electronic body music, which is a mixture of electronica, EDM, and of course industrial. And one thing I gotta bring up that I find kind of impressive with everything I want to be talking about within this tier is that this is the only thing within industrial music that actually has like a scene attached with it. Where everyone else, yeah, they'll experiment with this style of music, but there's only like niche fan bases attached with it. Where in club industrial, I feel like the reason why there is a particular scene with it is like with goth raves and nightclubs, is that all of these acts have like a similar song structure attached with it. And sure, maybe they might have some standout features like clean or harsh vocals, they might add in some synth pop or dark wave within the mixture. But again, for the most part, in terms of the actual song structure, it's very similar, and I feel like that's a huge reason why there is an actual scene with it, without of all the industrial subgenres you can find. Once again, I'm gonna breeze by through this tier really quickly, because I don't mean this in an insulting way, but there's not much to really discuss in terms of differences from all of these acts. Just simply put, if you enjoy one of them, more than likely you'll enjoy everything listed within this tier. But such noticeable names would be Wumshgut, Frontline Assembly, Suicide Commando, Niter Ebb, Front 242, Aesthetic Perfection, And One, Covenant, and Combi Christ. Moving down the chart, once again we've reached tier 3, which I call Expansive Industrial. This is the point in the chart where it gets very widespread now, because as I stated, it's Expansive Industrial. So this is like consisting of all acts that play around with rock music, hip hop, metal, techno, breakbeat, stuff like that, and they enhance it with the experimentation of industrial. So it's not just one particular genre now being listed within this tier, and I know it's going to get kind of convoluted. There's just so many different directions of styles I'm going to be talking about here. But the overall theme with it, as I stated, is it's just you think of a familiar style of music and you just enhance it and experiment it with industrial. The most noticeable one within this tier is going to be Death Grips, which seems to be like the internet band for a lot of people, which combines both hardcore hip-hop, industrial, and a lot of experimentation. And throughout the years, they have gained just such wide critical acclaim throughout the underground music scene that's really led to a lot of their success. But for a lot of people, they seem to be like the template for industrial hip-hop, which I always find kind of a bit odd, because there have been numerous other acts that have experimented in the ways of Death Grips, but I guess, you know, they just haven't gotten the critical acclaim as much as they have. But there are other great acts out there to check out if you enjoy Death Grips. Now, one noticeable comparison of a group that they're always compared to is, of course, Clipping. Now, I get the fact that they will always be compared because they're both labeled industrial hip-hop, but Clipping has way more of a traditional gangster rap style with it, with their flows and overall verses that David Dig provides. But yeah, if you want a good, gateway acts within industrial hip-hop, definitely check out either Death Grips or Clipping. The next inclusion might be a bit of a force, but I've noticed that, again, it's labeled like industrial in some cases, is JPEG Mafia. Now, while he's very unorthodox and has more of like this abstract approach within hip-hop, because of his just weird and unorthodox experimentations, having like noises and glitch samples throughout it, he may have like inadvertently created like some industrial moments within some of his songs. So I know this might be kind of a force to include him, but since he's often compared to a lot of like experimental hip-hop artists, JPEG Mafia kind of fits within this tier to some certain degree within the realms of industrial. Then of course there's Dialect. I love their album Absence, as it's a mixture again of hip-hop, industrial, and dark ambient music that is just so suffocating and dense that, again, I feel like metal fans can find a lot of enjoyment with it just because of how dark and morbid it comes off sounding like. The lyrical themes and just the overall vibe makes me feel like this album is meant for like an upcoming apocalypse. It's awesome stuff. And if I'm on the discussion with industrial hip hop, I gotta bring up which is arguably the first ever group to play this style of music, and that would be the Beatnags, which, yes, I'm purposely saying their band's name wrong with that particular syllable. But the Beatnags were an experimental hip-hop group that was active from 1986 to 1990, and they only released one full-length album. And what's really interesting is that this was put out through Alternative Tentacles, and this is a label that specializes in punk music, so it's quite the oddball for something like this to be put out through a punk label. But when you actually listen to this album, well, you'll hear like all these wild sounds of industrial percussions and all this just crazy noises going off with like hip hop verses. There's like the attitude of punk music attached with it because it's very politically charged. And yeah, if you want like industrial hip hop with the attitude of punk music, if that sounds appealing, definitely check these guys out because they were really ahead of their time for something like this. And I feel like because of that, that's why they got heavily ignored, and I guess all these years later they're kind of getting a bit more attention thanks to the internet, plus with Death Grips creating for a lot of people industrial hip hop. We're all looking towards the past to see what were kind of like the blueprints for it. That yeah, definitely check these guys out. If you enjoy Death Grips but you want like the 1980s version, as people call them to be, definitely check out the Beatnags. Next, I included Alien Sex Fiend with their 1987 full-length album, Here Come Germs. So, Alien Sex Fiend started out as like a gothic rock band or like a death rock band that had like post-punk tendencies. But around like the mid-80s and late 80s, they started experimenting with more electronic music. And with their 1987 full-length album, Here Come Germs, this is where they basically created like an EBM electronic album that, yeah, it's really similar to everything I talked about in the previous tier. However, there's just more of like gothic rock influences spread out within this album that I've always looked at Alien Sex Fiend, that it's basically, you take Ministry's approach to industrial music, but it's just more gothic rock influenced, I would say. I would also include the band Health. Now, while Health has always been labeled a noise rock band or an electronic rock band, it's really hard to pinpoint exactly what they are, because each album they'll shake it up just a bit. That, again, to pinpoint exactly what Health is quite the gamble. But there are some certain circumstances with some of their albums that they'll manipulate the sounds of the synthesizer in just such a weird and harsh way at times that they'll inadvertently create industrial, just like a lot of experimental bands do when they just kind of get lost with their experimentations, that I don't really feel like it's that far-fetched to call Health an industrial rock band at times. Up next is Atari Teenage Riot. Now, these guys created their own style of music, that being digital hardcore. Now, what is digital hardcore? Well, it's hardcore punk music that fuses together a lot of other electronic music such as drum and bass, gabber, breakcore, breakbeat, and of course industrial music. So really it's just like high energy hardcore punk that fuses together a lot of just like explosive electronic music, and it's really killer stuff. Then you got Machine Girl, which is a breakcore project, but it's often compared to Atari Teenage Riot because the tag of digital hardcore is attached with it. And while yes, breakcore is a style of music that's just a melting pot that just fuses together just like a laundry list of any electronic music you can name, what's really interesting is that some people label this particularly an industrial breakcore project, yet again, Machine Girl has always denounced that term. They never thought they were an industrial project. But when you listen to their debut full-length album, you just get these sporadic and crazy noises that, again, it just had to be with like manipulation with the synthesizers and all the programming that, yeah, it's not that far-fetched to say that there's a bit of like industrial work laced in throughout it.
And if you want to get into breakcore music, I would recommend checking out Machine Girl. And keeping in vein with kind of like this more punkish industrial approach, I would also recommend checking out Youth Code, that blends together EBM, again electronic body music, but there's just way more of like a punk attitude and vibe with it. And I feel like a huge reason as to why this has kind of won over some fans within industrial music is it really reminds a lot of them to that of like all the bands that were signed to Wax Track Records. It has like that particular sound with it that, yeah, if you want like Skinny Puppy, but you just want more emphasis on that punk vibe and sound, definitely check out Youth Code. Psychic TV's Force the Hand of Chance is a great representation of industrial folk music, or what it's mainly known as it being neo-folk. That, yeah, the inclusions of industrial music that kind of really enhances the folk melodies kind of work hand in hand, which is quite the oddball, but yeah, as you've seen throughout the decades, a lot of neo-folk bands would take this style and do their own twists and tweaks with it. But yeah, if you want a good introduction of what industrial folk music is, definitely check out Psychic TV with their debut full-length album. For a little bit of a deep cut, I really wanted to include Maynard Vale with his debut full-length album Body Count, which is a mixture of techno music, really similar to that of The Prodigy, but there's just such density and it just is layered with just such a murky, dreadful atmosphere that the inclusion of industrial, making it just all the more dense, kind of works in its favor, I would say. And damn, if you just want like a nightclub take of just like really dreary, dreadful music that you would still like bop your head to, definitely check out Maynard Vale, because I have just such fun listening to this. That it's basically everything again from the previous tier of like EBM, but just hits so much harder because of just how depressing it comes off sounding like. Next inclusion might be somewhat of a deep cut for this particular tier, but I feel like industrial fans might know of it. That being Coil with their 1986 full-length Horse Rotavator. That I kind of look at this as it kind of being like the influence to that of Ulver's full-length album, The Assassination of Julius Caesar, because it has like a synth pop kind of vibe with the singing at the very least, but again, they might deviate a bit with the experimentation. But yeah, if you enjoyed that particular Ulver album, or even Depeche Mode, but you just want like experimentation basically with the industrial aspect, definitely check out Coil. And the last inclusion for tier 3 will be Techno Animal, as its industrial breakbeat, and this stuff for me is just so addicting what Justin Broderick does with any of his industrial side projects, because he always seems to like to make it very gritty and sludgy sounding, how the rhythm sections and beats come off. Like, it just clicks with me so hard. And the last album that he did within Techno Animal would be like the fan favorite, that being Brotherhood of the Bomb, which ironically enough, this was released on 9/11 in 2001, which is just such weird timing with an album title like that. But what this is, you will get like these electronic breakbeat portions scattered throughout it, but for the most part, it's a hip-hop album, and this album's fun factor is just through the roof. I'm just addicted to this album and I absolutely love it. It's easily become one of my all-time favorite hip-hop albums just overall because it's just fun, and I can't stress that out enough. And while this band discontinued in 2004, they reformed in 2007 under a different name, that being Zonal. And Zonal is basically you take all the styles of what you would find with Techno Animal, but they infuse more drone and like sludge metal mixed in throughout it. That it's just more of like a metal version of that of Techno Animal, but it's still worthy of checking out. Moving on down to the next tier, to tier number 4, which I labeled as aggressive industrial. So everything listed within this tier is mainly metal and punk bands that utilize their experimentation to that more on the offense to give you like this audio attack. Obviously, I feel like the first band that needs to be brought up within this tier is Godflesh, again, another band done by Justin Broderick. But for a lot of people, Godflesh is like the harbinger for what it was, to showcase to people that you can combine extreme metal and industrial experimentation together that would really lay out the blueprints for a lot of other metal bands around the 90s and early 2000s of how to blend these two styles. That, yeah, you can be a metal band blending industrial music and sound just as pulverizing as any other death metal band out there. Immediately right after that, I would include Author and Punisher, which is often compared to that of Godflesh. That what's really interesting about this project is that it's one man, and all of the instruments that he utilizes besides his vocals and guitars is that they're all man-made by him. He's crafted these instruments to be used as like pitch shifters, that it's really creative and something quite different that showcases just the limitless possibilities of manipulation you can do within this style of music, of any kind of like music that blends together industrial. That it's, again, quite the standout, that if you're a metal fan and you want something just really pulverizing with like electronic music to enhance just the edge and sharpness of it, strongly recommend Author and Punisher. And of course, if I'm going to be talking about industrial metal, need be I must include Nail Bomb. Now this was back when it had, I believe, Max Cavalier when he used to be in Sepultura. This was what, 94, 95, so this was back when he used to be in Sepultura. But I know now he's in Soulfly. And the other member is Alex Newport, which I believe he was in the band Fudge Tunnel. And they made Nail Bomb, which is considered to be industrial thrash metal, which is quite interesting. And goddamn, this album is just so ass-kicking. As, yeah, you're gonna have like these thrash metal portions that make up the meat and potatoes of it, but all like these industrial segments scattered throughout it give it like this cyber warfare kind of feeling with it that still gives it like that grit and aggression you would want with a metal album. Just overall, it's so ass-kicking, but regardless, I feel like when it comes to just industrial metal, this is like another gateway that you all should just must know. Next inclusion is Street Sex, which is labeled as a hardcore punk industrial outfit that is just so aggressive and ass-kicking like everything else within this tier, because everything just feels like it's utilized like a percussion, like the screaming and the synthesizers always just feels like it's a punch in the face with every single verse and song that they release. The next inclusion might be kind of a stretch on my end, but I also included the band Big Black. Now they've always labeled themselves as just being another punk rock band, but to the fans they've kind of been idolized as just like big influences to that on industrial rock. Because the way they play their guitars is very unorthodox, and the noises and sounds you'll hear from it within their albums is just different, to say the least. That, yeah, there is like this industrial aspect to them in some way, shape, or form when you listen to it. But make no mistake about it, this is just really heavy and harsh punk music that, I don't know, I have a lot of fun with these guys, and the bass tone within some of these tracks are just so obnoxious but just so addicting to listen to. So whether you have heard this or not, hell, whether you even deem this to be industrial punk or not, regardless, definitely check out Big Black if you haven't heard of them, because this shit just slays. While I said a minute ago that primarily this tier consists of metal and punk bands, there are two hip-hop groups that I wanted to include within this tier that is, again, really aggressive for hip-hop standards. One being Blackie, which is spelled with spaces in between each letter. And I've always looked at Blackie as being basically Death Grips, but for depressed people. And while the similarities with the experimentation is there, I've always just found Blackie to be way more gritty and just aggressive and just meaner and more miserable. It's just a more emotive Death Grips, you can say, as well. And because of that, it just adds just such a more punchy sound with it, I would say, that, yeah, if you want some really hard-hitting hip-hop music that I feel like metal fans would really appreciate, definitely check out Blackie. And the other inclusion I wanted to bring up, which is a bit more on the edgy aspect, is Black Hand Path. That, wow, this stuff is mesmerizing and explosive. And while it's labeled mostly as a noise hip-hop project, there's just all these weird melodies scattered throughout it that it just feels like there's a bit of improv with everything that in some circumstances you could call it like industrial hip-hop, but god damn, this shit is just explosive. And I've recently discovered it, and I just had to bring it up within this video. Getting back on track with more of the punk aspect within this tier, next up is Panic DHH. And goddamn, this shit hits like a ton of bricks. While it may be kind of abrasive and droney, kind of scattered throughout the album, when this album hits with the punk aspect, holy hell, it will derail you. And I can't emphasize that enough. If you check out Panic DHH, get ready for some really destructive industrial punk music. And if you enjoy Panic DHH, I would also recommend checking out Void Dweller, and it's all one word. And holy fuck, this shit is a melting pot of every different style of aggressive electronic music just coming at you full force. And there's kind of like a DIY aspect attached with it, so it just makes it all the more gritty and aggressive and ruthless sounding. And I can't emphasize it enough, if you just want punishing sounding music, check out Void Dweller as well. And the final mention, thus closing off tier 4, will be the Shizit. And this is another digital hardcore band, just like Atari Teenage Riot, only this is just way more explosive. The screaming is a bit more abrasive. All of the breakcore beats scattered throughout it just feel more punchy. The guitarists just feel more crushing. It's just basically Atari Teenage Riot on steroids. And like everything else within this list, if you want more explosive electronic music, definitely check this out as well. Once again, time to go down another tier within this chart. We have reached tier number 5, which I call Nightmare Industrial. The name for this tier is pretty self-explanatory. It's industrial-based music that's more frightening and provoking, that there's more of like experimentation, you can say, but in a way that's just very unsettling. That if you want more of an experience and less of music that gives you like a bop attached with it, a lot of these acts might really interest you. I feel like the most noticeable act to bring up within this tier would be Lingua Ignota, where over the past handful of years she's gained quite the bit of success by a lot of people within the fan base. And I feel like it all has to do with the fact that she blends together a lot of different styles of music, such as neoclassical, dark wave, and she's even flirted around with the styles of that being death industrial, which I'll get to that later on within this video. But I feel like if you want a good gateway project to give you the experience of what like nightmarish experimental electronic music can create, Lingua Ignota is the best place to start. Right after her is The Body, which with their album Nobody Deserves Happiness is the most like industrial fueled album that they've released, because for the most part The Body is deemed to be like an experimental doom metal band that, you know, plays around with different styles such as sludge metal, drone, ambience, and noise. But they experiment a lot, and I can't emphasize that enough. But again, it's very creepy and odd and weird, and the screams and the vocals, if you want to call it that, that The Body has throughout their albums, it always just gives me the chills, and it's just so unnerving sounding that it's quite hard to describe. It's just something you have to listen to understand. Then there's MZ412, which is an industrial project that blends together a lot of like ritualistic sounding music. There's tribal music with the percussions at times, a lot of experimentation, and it's pretty abstract with how it blends together noises. That I feel like for the most part, this is an industrial project, the meat and potatoes of what they utilize with their influence, that was focused on the black metal fan base with its aesthetic and vibe. That, yeah, if you're primarily a black metal fan, but you just want like the vibe of just straight up industrial music, definitely check out MZ412. Another project that actually did a split with MZ412 that's very similar in style and pacing is Trapanarian's Ritualin, I think is the right way to say it. And this is like really ritualistic electronic music that makes it quite different. Again, there's elements of death industrial, harsh vocals, noise, and ambience and drone. It's just basically any way you can make electronic music abrasive and unsettling while also making it like ritualistic and spiritual in a nightmarish way. This project does that with all of its releases, and it's really intriguing but also very frightening at the same time. And if you want even more nightmarish music, I would recommend checking out Diamanda Galas with her full-length album Plague Mass. That Diamanda Galas is quite the musician and individual as an artist as a whole. Like, she's done a lot in her life and made a lot of different music. She is one of a kind, to say the least, and her vocals, I really honestly wish I could describe what it is, because it's a style of vocals that I'm really unfamiliar with, and I can't search up exactly what it is, but she's got her own style, to say the very least, and from what I've heard, she's quite the big influence to that on even Lingua Ignota. But damn, this stuff is demonic sounding and really unsettling. And with her full-length album Plague Mass, it's like electronic experimental music done in a very minimalistic way. It's meant to give off just like a backdrop of like some really brooding, drony noises, but you really pay attention more to her vocals, and again, it's just very different and abstract, to say the very least. And what's really eye-opening about this album is that she actually performed it in the St. John Cathedral in New York around, I believe, like 1990 or so, which gave her quite a bit of notoriety, both in a good or bad way, depending on how you look at it, to some people, because it all had to do with the AIDS pandemic that was going on. It was kind of like a lash out against what was happening in society by performing it there, since, you know, the church doesn't really pay attention to stuff like that. But yeah, it's just like, I really am kind of at a loss for words with her as a performer, because it's just so different and against the norm from what I'm primarily used to. Then there's the Haxan Cloak, which is primarily a dark ambient project that at times will have like some weird noises to shake up all the ambience that kind of consumes the listener, that I've always just found this music just so unsettling. I don't know, it just really doesn't give me any ease. Like, there's tension that either lingers in the background or kind of builds up and never has like a release point. And with the industrial segments that's been manipulated with the synthesizers, it only adds to like the schizophrenic nature I kind of get from it. That, yeah, if you just want some really dense and dreary, dark ambient music that consumes you and it just kind of becomes like background music that's kind of like unsettling, at least from my perspective, the Haxan Cloak might resonate to your taste. Closing out tier number 5, which is not as nightmarish, it's just weird, but I feel like it's something to kind of like ease the mood from everything I've talked about, is the project called Warning. This is a German techno-electronic group that was only active for a handful of years in the early 80s, but god damn, they were quite ahead of the curve back then, because it's just so weird but just so interesting. And the reason why I put it within the tier of nightmare industrial is not only just the vocals being like kind of guttural sounding, which again is quite odd for 1980 standards, but it feels like I entered like a nightclub that's meant for like upbeat techno music, but I'm having like a really bad acid trip. I just don't care because I just want to enjoy the atmosphere I'm in, if that makes any sense. Like, that's what Warning gives off. And yeah, out of everything within this tier, it's the one that I find to be primarily the most fun sounding out of everything. Reaching now the second to last tier, that being tier number 6, as I titled it, True Industrial. The title of this tier is pretty self-explanatory. This consists of all the industrial acts that are just straight up industrial. It's like unadulterated industrial for the most part. If there are any other inclusions of different subgenres attached with it, it's used in a very minimal way. For a lot of people, this is like unadulterated industrial straight up. So primarily this is going to consist of acts and groups that were formed around the late 70s and early 80s when industrial was becoming its own thing. The first two are primarily the ones that get the most amount of traction, which I feel like mainly it's because when you look at the history of industrial music, these are like considered to be like the first two to create it. Obviously that being Throbbing Gristle and Einstürzende Neubauten, that use machinery and a lot of abstract experimentations that to a lot of people they're like the forefathers and creators of this style of music. And it's really interesting, again, when you look at the harbingers and innovators for this style of music, what they were doing, because it's really like an art house take of contemporary music for its time, and it's really interesting just to give a listen to understand where industrial comes from. You could also include White House within this tier, and while I understand within the realms of power electronics and noise they're like big innovators to that, however during their early beginnings they were a part of the industrial records and music scene, which was all about obviously industrial music. And what they were doing in manipulating all the pedals, soundboards, and electronics at their disposal, you could arguably say that their early releases was like in the realms of that of what Throbbing Gristle and everyone else was doing when trying to create industrial music. The artist who goes by the stage name of Zev has often been credited as being one of the pioneers as well to industrial music. And with his debut full-length album that was released back in 1981, Production and Decay of Spatial Relations, while it is very minimalistic within its approach and may not be the most eventful thing you hear, all the abstract noises again fits within the realms of like what true industrial is. And this might be a bit of a stretch because they weren't really doing anything that they were trying to find a label with other than they were influenced by punk music. But you could say that Suicide was arguably the first ever industrial punk band. You could arguably say that, but how odd and weird the synthesizer is utilized. It has just such a staticky and abstract sound going along with the vocals that sing over it. It's like it is and it isn't at the same time within the realms of industrial. Like, it's a very abstract album to say the least, and throughout the years it's gained more attention, I would say, thanks to the internet rediscovering all these hidden gems from the past. But yeah, if you want like a true industrial take on like what industrial punk would be, Suicide would be your answer. SBK's full length from 1982, Leichenschrei, which, by the way, I absolutely love the album cover. It's totally badass looking. They were an Australian industrial project that I would say out of everything within this list, this is probably the most fun I had listening to an album, because there's quite a bit of hooks, even though there's a lot of like abstract noises going off. Again, it resembles the minimalistic approach of what industrial was supposed to be in the early 80s, but the synthesizers and the percussions just give off like a bit of rhythm that, I don't know, kind of gets a bit of like hooks with it, I would say. That it's probably like the most accessible thing out of the whole list within this tier, I would say. Gotta also bring up Nurse with Wound, as this is a project that primarily focuses more on the dark ambient side of things with a lot of experimentation. However, John Stapleton, the mastermind behind this project, has always been fascinated with the philosophy and movement of surrealism, and he wanted to attach that aesthetic with Nurse with Wound. And when you listen to anything that this project has put out, it's quite out there with its experimentations that, yeah, it's pretty surreal sounding to say the least. I'd also include Current 93 Dog's Blood Rising. And while we all know this project primarily for all the neo-folk albums, as David Tibet's approach within Current 93 would heavily influence a lot of neo-folk bands and artists, when he first started out in the 80s with his music, a lot of it was just these weird, contemporary, abstract, experimental projects. And even when he started out Current 93, he did a lot of experimentation. And I've always found this album to just be so different. It kind of like becomes unsettling for me. Cro-Magnon is a band that I made a video about, I think a year ago, talking about a band that accidentally made heavy music. And their album that was released back in 1969, which is their only release they would ever do, is experimental music to say the least. Like, it's really hard to pinpoint what it is. I know some people say it's like a black metal album because there's harsh vocals when you listen to the opening track on the album, but to some others, even though this was released in 1969, this was like what industrial music is all about. Having all this experimentation, manipulating vocals, using all these abstract ways of recording your instruments, because I believe they recorded some of the album in like a bathroom stall because of the tiles that would bounce off of the instruments to really enhance their production value. And all of just these weird, wacky experimentation sounds you'll get from like, I don't know, this or whatever have you they used. To some people, yeah, this is almost like proto-industrial music, but I would say for the most part, it's just an experimental album that really didn't have a sense of direction, that you could connect it to so many genres of music out there. And how fitting it is that this project's name is called Cro-Magnon, which is like, you know, the prototype to the Homo sapien for some people. That a band's name being Cro-Magnon is like the prototype to so many styles of music that we try to connect it with to make sense of it. But yeah, you can even attach the words to that this is like proto-industrial. And the final inclusion for this tier is quite the stretch, to say the least, because this arguably is the oldest thing I've ever talked about here on my channel thus far. But this is Pierre Schaeffer, who was a French composer, and he released audio back in 1948 of a train going by. And he's kind of like the foundation of that to what musical concrete would be, which is kind of like, man, how to describe this? A style of music where you use like tape manipulation to that, of like looping and sampling and doing a lot of tape manipulation to create different sounds. And To some people, musical concrete is like the true definition of like proto-industrial. So to some people, industrial music dates all the way back to the 1940s. And I find this just really interesting, even though it may be so simple, it's like, ooh, it's the sounds of a train just looped, that we date the idea of industrial being created all the way back almost a century ago. I find this just really interesting. Now time for the final tier. That being tier number 7, which I titled simply Death Industrial. So what exactly is Death Industrial? Well, earlier in this video I talked about such acts like Lingua Ignota and MZ412 that kind of play around with Death Industrial here and there. Well, everything within this list is just 110% full force for the playing style of that being Death Industrial. And from my understanding, it's a little bit less abrasive compared to power electronics, so it borderlines on the noise aspect within the spectrum of music. However, it's a bit more usage of loops and harsh vocals, make it a smidge more accessible than power electronics, but it's the overall sound and vibe of like this really dense atmosphere that just feels like your head's about to cave in at any point when you listen to the audio being presented from any of these acts I'm about to be talking about. So from my personal viewpoint, this is industrial done in the most brutal ways possible. What is considered to be the first ever Death Industrial project is Brighter Death Now. The individual behind this, I believe, is also the owner to that of Cold Meat Industries, so, you know, this individual has always been fascinated with just really harsh electronic music, but Brighter Death Now is just really menacing and just soul derailing atmospheres, just make it very unsettling. And from that description with Brighter Death Now, it really resembles everything else I'm about to be talking about, that really this tier's list just consists of what I would consider to check out if you want to get into Death Industrial. Another name that's often credited for really enhancing Death Industrial to become its own thing is the Grey Wolves. And once again, yeah, if you just really want your head kind of caved in with its unsettling atmosphere and noises, yeah, right after Brighter Death Now, definitely check out the Grey Wolves. But my personal favorite within Death Industrial would definitely be Genocide Organ, because while everything I've talked about thus far, there is like structure kind of attached with it thanks to how they kind of like loop the sounds of everything, Genocide Organ really has pinned down the right ways of, in my personal view, how to add structure within this very harsh and unsettling style of music. And maybe it's just their imagery that they attach with their album artworks or the audio samples that they use, but they seem to be obsessed with the idea of just showing how terrible reality is in the most unapologetic ways possible, that I really feel like they're the true definitions of like what Death Industrial is all about. That personally, from my experiences, this is like the gateway project to check out if you want even the slightest hint of what like true full force Death Industrial is. I'd also like to bring up within this tier Death Pile. And while yes, within the realms of power electronics, this is like one of the greatest albums for this style of music, and yes, it's very abrasive, it's very harsh and very noisy is what you would expect from power electronics. That's, you know, not meant for the faint of heart. However, with some of the loops with the audio samples within some of the songs, it kind of resembles what Death Industrial is all about. That, yeah, arguably you can say it's a power electronics album, but I don't think it's far-fetched to categorize it as Death Industrial. Regardless, if you really want a good gateway album for these styles of just very abrasive, soul-crushing noise music, Death Pile is a must-know. And if you enjoy Death Pile, I would also recommend checking out Remla with their album Hole in Heart. Now this album goes on for over 80 minutes, so prepare yourself if you're really going for a deep dive listen, trying to withstand every moment within the album. But there are some moments of like ambient interludes that are still abrasive. It's still nothing that is going to give you any sense of like relaxation within noise. But yeah, again, within the description of what Death Industrial is, you can kind of categorize it within it. But for the most part, again, it's kind of looked at as like this power electronic classic within the noise community. And the final inclusion for this iceberg chart, thus closing it off entirely, will be Atrix Morgue. Now, this is another Death Industrial project, just like everything else that's harsh and really disturbing sounding, that just, again, it's going to feel like your head's about to cave in with the sheer density of everything. However, what makes this really disturbing is just the context attached with it. Because the individual behind this project was not the most mentally stable individual. Like, he was always fascinated with death to the point that he himself was like always on the verge of wanting to commit suicide. And because of that, everything you will listen to that this project has within the discography is basically just an individual on the verge of wanting to kill himself. So you're hearing just basically like someone making music saying, hey, I'm about to do it at any moment right now, and this is just how I express myself. So it just really adds to just the unsettling nature of everything. That I'd argue this is some of the most fucked up audio you can hear within this world. And what really makes it messed up is that sadly he would later on kill himself, or commit suicide by hanging himself back in 2007. So all that's left are kind of like these audio clippets of him just basically crying out for not really help, but just expressing how much he was just on the verge of wanting to die. So yeah, it's just really fucked up shit. Alright guys, and with that will conclude the Industrial Iceberg chart. I hope you guys enjoyed it. It was quite the pain in the ass to make with all the research I had to do. And that'll do it for this video, guys. So like always, make sure you guys drink plenty of water to stay hydrated, and have a great day.